This is CTO Insights, a podcast on engineering leadership. I'm Katerina, your host, and I'm here to bring you insights from senior engineering leaders and experts on creating a culture of high performance. Today, I have the pleasure of hosting Manuel Pais, co-author of Team Topologies, the book that reshaped the way companies structure their teams for high performance. With years of hands-on experience working with global organizations, Manuel specializes in optimizing team interactions, reducing complexity, and driving value. We discuss the challenges of traditional team structures and the importance of intentional team organization. We explore the key components of the Team Topologies framework, delving into organizing tech organizations into streamlined teams, platform teams, enabling teams, and complicated subsystems teams. Manuel emphasizes the need for continuous evolution in organizations, understanding how the team structure and interactions between teams should evolve to enable a faster flow. He shares insights on restructuring for high performance, enabling autonomy within the teams, and moving the role of management toward providing context rather than planning work. This episode is brought to you by Adiva, a global talent network that I founded back in 2014 that connects companies with top-tier tech and product talent ready to hit the ground running. With the ability to introduce a candidate within 24 hours and an exceptional 98% success rate on trial engagements, Adiva offers the flexibility for companies to scale their teams up or down as needed. If you're looking to expand your team, drive momentum in your projects, or need to backfill a role, Adiva might just be the solution you need. Visit adivait.com to get started. Manuel, welcome. Thank you for accepting my invite to join me today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
You are the co-author of the book Team Topologies, and it has influenced the whole industry, basically. A lot of companies that I have spoken to, a lot of them being guests on this podcast, they reference to the framework and the book and, as something that has helped them increase the performance in their teams. Before we dive into the core concepts and how can companies implement this, what were the challenges that you saw in traditional teams, traditional setups that kind of pushed you to drive change in this way?
Yeah, it's a good question. So effectively, let's say roughly 5 years before the book came out, so between 2014 and 2019, both me and Matthew, the other co-author, we were doing a lot of consulting around DevOps and continuous delivery. And so a lot of organizations wanted to accelerate their delivery of their software and their products. And often they thought the way to do that was with better tooling, better practices. And yes, it helped to some extent. But what we saw time and time again was sort of lack of intentionality on how we organize teams and how we assign responsibilities and let's say the mission of the teams tended to be very kind of in an ad hoc way, almost like within, let's say, the technology or the engineering side, where we have a team that's working on this component and now we need to build some other stuff, so maybe we need a new team. And there was not a lot of attention to, okay, what are actually what we call the streams of value, right? I think these days we hear a lot more talking about value stream management, value stream mapping, but there was a lack of intentionality on which teams should be responsible for what and what is the value that that thing is going to deliver to the customers, first of all. And then secondly, if we want those teams to go fast, to be able to deliver and effectively get quick feedback on what they're delivering and whether it's working or not, what do we need to do to achieve that, right? That was the second part. And so, yes, the book came out, or we wrote the book after several years of looking at, okay, this pattern seemed to work well in this context, also looking at what other companies were doing, and we did a fair amount of research as well so that we could come up with the patterns that we talk about in the book, which effectively are sort of, um, in a way, some kind of helpful constraints on how we think about organizing teams in a way that helps us get to faster flow of value to the customers.
And if you're about to explain the framework on a high level, and feel free to use any practical examples that would kind of paint a better picture here. What are the key components? What are the key things that affect the performance?
Yeah, so the starting point of the book is that if we want to have these teams that can go fast and can have what we call end-to-end ownership or end-to-end stewardship of a service, let's call it a service that is valuable to the business, then obviously those teams need to be cross-functional. You're going to need different capabilities in those teams, but they also need to be much more, let's say, business context aware versus being a team that's purely focused on technology and someone else is, doing the backlog or deciding what they should build, and they just take those requests and implement them. So we're talking about teams that have a broader remit, which then leads us to the problems, the difficulties of doing that, which have to do with how do we get the team to have all the competencies that they need for this kind of end-to-end ownership, from understanding the business and the customers to we actually build and deliver this service, and we operate this service as well in production. And there are issues around what is too much, right? What is the size of such a service that makes sense for a team that we're usually talking around, between 7-9 people? Can be a bit less, a bit more, but that's usually the range. So it's not a huge team, big for reasons of keeping the internal coordination, communication reasonable as well, and building trust inside the team. And so that's where we then introduce other types of teams to help address this, at least these two main challenges of what we call stream aligned teams.
Mhm.
Since you mentioned an example, it was quite interesting because a company called Uswitch in the UK. It's not a huge company, but it's not a startup anymore, or for a long. They've been around for, I think, over 20 years now. And what's interesting is that at the same time that we were discussing these ideas and eventually wrote the book, they were actually already had this idea of having what we call streamlined teams, right?
Mhm.
So they purposely decided, because they were at early stages, they needed to build their customer base, they needed to find product market fit, and they intentionally said, we're not going to restrict teams in terms of what technology they use, and there's no sort of centralized teams taking care of certain technology or processes. We are going to give as much freedom as possible for these stream-aligned teams to make decisions very quickly, both on technology side and on the business side. Obviously, we provide the context and we provide what are the business goals, but then let them figure out what they need to do to get there. And that was quite successful for them. And what happened was then they started getting into the problem of these teams have to worry about too many details, what they called low value decisions around, do we use this database service, or do we use this deployment tool, or like they've eventually, as those services grew that they were responsible for, they were spending most of their time with this type of what we call extraneous cognitive load, in the sense of they're not actually working anymore on what are the business goals, what are the customer problems or needs. They were just, most of the time was taken with those lower value tasks compared to their, in the context of their mission. And so that's when they introduced, for example, a platform to reduce a lot of that sort of cognitive load. And this was happening at the same time that I was writing the book, but they were very much aligned to these principles that we were talking about. And eventually, when we sort of met them, they adopted the book because it gave them the terminology to talk about what they were doing in a better way. And for us, was a great example of what we're talking about.
That's amazing. And I wanted to discuss this. Like, I love the example. It kind of leads me to my next question about, when is the right time to introduce all of the concepts of this book? And I assume it should be done iteratively. So, for example, this company, when they were trying to find a product market fit, they needed to iterate more and be more adaptive and everything. So they needed the flexibility to make decisions fast. So at that point, it was only this streamlined team, or maybe it would be just the CTO of an early stage startup of just a couple of people. And so can we go through the evolution? Like, as an ideal example of, so we can focus on two different examples here. One would be a startup, which is like this example that you just mentioned, starting with a team that's mainly focused on feature delivery and then doing all of the decisions they need to do on the way. And then evolving from there to what would be kind of the ideal setup based on Team Topologies. And then on the other side, companies that are more mature and have more traditional setup, I would like to dive into how can they transition seamlessly. It should, I guess, again, be done in iterations because otherwise it's very difficult to do a massive change all at once.
Yes, you already mentioned that. I fully agree. There is a sort of historically organizational design and reorganizations have typically been kind of large efforts. Obviously, the larger the organization, the bigger the transformation you need to do. But they've usually been seen as this one giant step where we're at this point and now we need to do all these changes because of agile or DevOps or whatever, or we want to be product centric as well. And then we're trying to change everyone at the same time to this ideal next state. And that's usually sort of, in some cases falls apart, in other cases just doesn't reach the benefits that were expected. So to your point, yes, that we should definitely look at much more continuous reorganization. I prefer to say continuous evolution, looking at, okay, what are the problems we're facing? Do we need to introduce this type of team? Do we need to actually have different interactions? Do we need more collaboration or do we need less collaboration? Because maybe the collaboration is just hiding some dependencies that are blocking teams. And that requires a level of self-awareness as well, which is another thing that we start to see more. And I think the Uswitch example is interesting because they had, especially their CTO had this self-awareness, if you like, things are not going, what worked until now is really not working that well anymore. We need to do something. And that's most organizations don't have, either you have someone at C level or VP level who has this kind of awareness, or there's no one in the organization whose responsibility or part of their responsibility is to look at these sort of challenges, right? So you have the teams that are super busy and often don't have the capacity to be, looking at how to improve flow, how do we reduce dependencies because they're just, get things done. And then if you don't have, typically there's no one looking at those type of problems. We've had one customer where they actually had a very strong agile coaching community, so a group of agile coaches, and they not only help the teams, but they were also work closely together as a group. And they had an interesting. They were able to have this almost X-ray vision, right? Because together they could see, yes, we have those dependencies, and yes, we have these similar problems in these other teams. But in that example, they didn't have really the authority to then go and make changes. So they had visibility, but not the authority. But yes, coming back to your question, it's probably something that in hindsight I would have tried to strengthen in the book, is the fact that even before we think about structures and introducing different types of teams, we should be thinking about more about the patterns and the interactions. So typical example is a startup. And although I mentioned USwitch as a good example, I think they could also have maybe adopted some of especially the platform and enabling patterns earlier than they did, because they got to a point where they really were getting stuck, if you like, going quite slow in terms of delivering value. But what I usually say to startups is, yes, you're not going to have enough people to have a dedicated platform team or dedicated enabling team, but the patterns can be instilled from early days. So that might mean, for example, your platform between codes is just a very good wiki that provides good examples on how do we use AWS, or how do we do this type of how do we do deployments, or how do we do user research, right? Can be anything, but in a way that's easy to sort of consume, and for new people, especially that are coming to the startup, to be able to look at that and say, okay, this gives me a good understanding. It doesn't make me a specialist, but it gives me a good understanding of how we're doing things here and why. And so that could be sort of a very minimum viable platform, if you like, at the startup. You will need some people, probably people who are more senior, in the sense they've been around maybe from the beginning, or for a longer time in the startup, to spend some effort, obviously, but you don't need a dedicated team. And the same for more the enabling type of work, where it won't be a dedicated team, but you can have, again, people who are more experienced help others, not just inside their team, but maybe other teams that are being started, to help them sort of more quickly get an understanding of what decisions we've made, what are we doing in terms of our practices, our business context. And so you set up those patterns and those ways of thinking from early days, and then when you're growing and maybe you're already a scale up, then yes, it makes sense to have an actual platform team or multiple teams, enabling teams, etc. And you already have those sort of behaviors in place.
This was exactly what I wanted to ask. It is a mindset, basically. It's not something that, like, there is a specific stage or specific size of the company where you need to focus on implementing this. It's more of a mindset of even one person can have all of these roles, but then they think about and more intentional.
Yeah, I agree. It's more about what are the patterns that are helpful, and then the implementation, if you like, can change, where do we actually have a team or multiple teams, or is just like I said, someone or a couple of people dedicating a bit of their time to maintain this wiki as a platform, or doing some mentoring, enabling other people. So the implementation can vary depending on uh, the size of the organization and the maturity as well. We can go all the way to sort of the other side, because you also asked about bigger organizations, more established. For example, with enabling teams, um, which is maybe a pattern that for some organizations feels a bit strange because they're not used to have people who are, let's say, experts helping others. They're used to these experts, they should be doing the expert work in a way. But for example, me and Eduardo da Silva, who worked for several years at a company called bol.com in the Netherlands. So they're a big online retailer in other countries in Europe, but they're based in Netherlands. Sort of a Dutch Amazon kind of thing. Um, and they, they're not a huge company, but they're quite a big company. And for example, we talk about this in one of the courses we have in our academy, which is about how to grow enabling teams. Not because we must have enabling teams, but because we have a need that requires this type of approach. So in their case, and this goes back several years, but when they started introducing kind of the ideas of data science and machine learning, in the beginning they had a couple of teams, right? The data science teams, and they would do all the work that's within that domain. And then as they saw the benefits, and this started to be something that more and more teams wanted to have access and be able to introduce in their own services, they realized this is no longer something that can be the responsibility of a few teams. It needs to be something that's more of an organizational capability, right? We are going to need most teams to somehow be able to have that expertise to some extent. And so they built up this, again, like you switch, they were part of this was before the book, so they were applying the ideas without the vocabulary yet. But essentially, they created a department that was not focused on doing the data science work, but they were focusing on how do we help the teams gain enough capabilities. And then you have differences where some teams actually had very data intensive needs, and they maybe they need an actual data science engineer in the team. Others just needed a little bit of competence that could be facilitated, and they effectively scale this enabling approach for data science by identifying the needs of the teams, what are the gaps, and then what are the ways in which we can help them. And effectively, they had a sort of, if you like, more a structural enabling team, the people who were looking at these gaps and looking at, okay, what else do we need to do? And then they had more on the ground enabling teams that were people, the data science experts that were going to the product teams, if you like, or streamline teams, and helping them kind of take the next steps. Okay, you need to know this, you need to know that. Here's a good tool, perhaps. And also then building some of the more platform data science related services that the teams could use.
So
So that's like the other end of the sort of range where they actually had to build all these teams.
Right. I have a few follow-up questions, but before we continue, I'd like to summarize the types of teams because I realized we didn't emphasize all of them, and for people that haven't read the book, it might be a bit, overwhelming. Maybe you can just describe all of them in just a short sentence.
Sure, I'll try. So the streamline teams are those teams that I've been talking as the starting point. If you like, kind of your cross-functional product teams. The reason why we use stream is because often, products are quite big, and you need to then sort of break it down into multiple streams, where the stream might be maybe user journey or a user persona that has different needs from other user personas. Somehow, these days most products and systems are quite big, so you cannot have one team. You need to figure out the streams within this larger product or system. And then we talk about platform teams. with a specific focus, which is to reduce cognitive load that I was talking about earlier on those streamlined teams. So yes, they might typically provide services and tooling that helps multiple teams. But the difference from kind of traditional platforms is that if we want to reduce cognitive load, we need to really have a user-centric approach to the platform. We need to collaborate with the teams. We need to make sure that we're not actually adding more load on them because we're offering something that is not a good fit to their needs or something that's not reliable or doesn't cover their use case. So that's sort of a more kind of nuanced difference, but it's actually quite critical. It's not just here's a platform with some shared services. It's maybe have less services, but make sure those really help your internal teams go faster, not slow them down. And then we have enabling teams. As I said before, it could be that you don't actually have dedicated teams. It's also common to see platform teams that spend some of their capacity doing enabling type of work. But when you have gaps in some domains that are important, an enabling team can be very effective. So that's usually a team of experts in some domain. Like I mentioned, data science could be um, anything else, could be around automation, could be maybe now that we talk a lot about Gen AI, maybe that's an approach that could work where we're trying to bring to the streamline teams kind of the basic understanding of how do you use this new tooling, how does this impact you, and so on. So those are the enabling teams. They help kind of bridge some gaps in capabilities of the streamline teams. And then we have a last type, which is complicated subsystem team, which is something we debated for a good while. It's kind of an exception. You shouldn't expect to have many complicated subsystem teams. Again, it's when we focus on the cognitive load aspect. Sometimes there are some parts of a service that are quite complicated. They have a very complicated algorithm, or they require the type of PhD type of understanding. One example I give, usually because many years ago I worked at a company where we had identity verification systems and border control systems. They all use this face recognition module. So that was essentially a complicated subsystem. Obviously, these days you have commercial options, but at the time they were not available. So we had someone with a PhD who was the person who knew all the kind of complexity and be able to change that subsystem. But sometimes we see when we look at also kind of visualizations of the teams and so on, when we see a lot of complicated subsystems, and probably sort of missing the point there to some extent.
So in bigger, like more established organizations, you would typically see the need for, like you mentioned, the enabling team as one example, the need of a new team rising to resolve some challenges they're facing and then evolve from there? Or would you suggest a restructure? Let's say I come to you, I have a large team working on some online platform for matching, like Adiva, for example, companies with talent, and then we are struggling to ship work. How would you suggest we start restructuring? And apart from the specific teams, what would be the collaboration between them? Like how would not only collaboration, but integration of all of the teams, basically? How can they work together seamlessly to deliver what the business needs?
So it really depends a lot on the context, but
if you'd like me to clarify, mostly the question that I want to go through is like a company that is struggling, let's say, with deadlines and they're not releasing valuable work fast enough because of the high cognitive load or other challenges within the teams. They don't have the proper structure to enable high performance. And you come as a consultant. What would you advise them? Where would you advise them to start, and how would the process evolve from there to ensure they can deliver work faster?
Yeah. So usually what I would recommend is to start with a kind of pilot, right? So like we discussed earlier, don't try to change all the teams at the same time, but let's focus on a small group of teams that probably work closely together. Um, and even before we try to kind of change the structures or the responsibility of the teams, I would try to figure out, okay, what is blocking teams? What are kind of the dependencies they have that make them go slow? And then figure out, is this something where maybe if you collaborate with this other team with the goal of reducing the dependency you have on them, maybe we depend on this other team to do testing for us, or maybe we depend on another team to do security for us, security checks. So can we start using what some of the interaction modes that we talk about in the book? Can we collaborate in order to reduce this dependency? Is there a better way that we can do this, or maybe we can automate some things so that we don't depend on this other team as much? Or is it, doing some facilitating work, some enabling type of work where this other team knows a lot about testing, for example? Can you help us sort of get started so we can actually create our first automated tests, for example? Because although people focus a lot on the structures and the types of teams, it's actually these interactions and addressing problems with the right interactions actually critical. Um, and so I would typically start there. I would start looking at, okay, what are really the issues that are affecting cognitive load on teams. So in the past few years, we've done a lot of work together with someone with PhD in psychology around what are actually the factors that influence cognitive load on teams. So we've actually came up with a pretty good model. It's not complete because it's sort of something that's never complete. Of course, there are more factors that influence cognitive load, but we have a pretty good understanding now of what are some of the factors that influence teams. And so we actually built a tool based on that model, which is called Temperature, that people can have a look. But essentially, we're looking at 4 areas. What is the impact of the characteristics of the teams? What is the impact of the characteristics of the work itself? What is the impact of your work practices and processes on your cognitive load? And finally, what is the impact of the work environment and the tooling that you have to do your work? So we now have this kind of more science-based, systematic way of checking. Well, and then we can look across multiple teams and we start to see trends. Yes, several teams have issues with, I don't know, maybe the team is quite large, they have too many stakeholders, so it's very hard to deal with conflicting priorities and a lot of context switching, and that's maybe one of the main reasons why they overloaded.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a pretty good sort of diagnostic to figure out, okay, where should we start, so that we're not just start changing everything and we don't really know exactly. We have an idea this will be helpful, but now we can have some data that helps us make better decisions. And then typically based on that, we might want to have smaller teams that are more aligned to a clear purpose, right? And so there are some techniques we can use, like maybe domain-driven design or other techniques that can help us break down this bigger service or product into smaller parts that have value to the customer. Um, or it might be that it's more kind of a problem with the processes and the tooling, where maybe if we have a good platform approach, that might help the teams reduce that cognitive load. So yeah, that said, I would like to mention one example that we have. One of the early adopters of Team Topologies was a company called Pure Gym, which is a chain of gyms in Europe, but based in the UK as well. And they actually decided they were going so slow in terms of adding more value to their digital services, that for a multitude of reasons, because they were very project oriented and they had this big monolith that they had basically one huge system, but they actually decided not just to reorganize with Team Topologies principles, but they also said, okay, we know there's a lot of change happening and responsibilities changing and new roles, etc. We're going to take 3 months or whatever time it was, where we expect the new teams that they reorganized into not to be delivering value, but actually just figuring out what needs to happen in terms of collaboration with other teams, what kind of maybe new tooling we need, what kind of new competencies we need to then, after that period, we're in a better state to then start accelerating, which was interesting because that would not be my usual recommended approach, but there's not a one one single approach, so it worked for them. And obviously they had buy-in all the way to the top of the organization to do that.
One final thing to wrap up with, I want to touch on the practical approach of planning for each of these teams. So how would that go, and the whole integration again?
So the ideal, if we're talking sort of the ideal approach, would be we have multiple of these stream-aligned teams, right? So if we've done the work to figure out what are the independent streams or mostly independent streams, like I said earlier, where we might have, or in the example of Pure Gym, we have this big product where everyone was working on everything, or maybe was feature teams or project teams. If we're able to do the work of actually identifying what are the streams of value within this larger system or product, which are fairly independent, then we can align the teams to those independent streams. That's if we really want fast flow of value, we should expect that sort of we're getting towards more independent teams working on sort of parallel streams of value to the customer. And that means that sometimes we have some inconsistencies across these different teams, and we sort of should accept that as well. Not everything is going to be perfectly aligned, and yes, there might be sometimes inconsistencies, but we're focusing on improving the flow of value, so we accept those inconsistencies. There's actually a really good quote from Adrian Cockcroft, who worked at he was, I think, architect and also leader at Amazon and Netflix and other kind of big tech companies, and he was basically saying that, like, if you want fast flow, is going to look like that: multiple streams of value that eventually are consistent but not all the time, and the role of management is more to provide context and provide direction, and not so much planning the work of those teams, right? That said, obviously depending on where you're starting from, it might take longer to get there because you have to build competencies inside the teams as well. And as mentality changes sometimes in terms of now, you want teams who actually have this end-to-end ownership of that stream, not just someone decides what to do and we just implement it.
That's great. Well, thank you, Manuel. It was a great pleasure to discuss.
Thank you.
Yeah, for everyone that wants to dive deeper, I really recommend reading the book.
Yeah, and if I might say, the main site you can find a lot of resources and links to the academy and so on is teamtopologies.com. So pretty straightforward.
Thank you once again.
Thank you.